medieval medicine could cure almost nothing. It could set a broken bone, drain a wound, mix a herbal remedy that sometimes helped and sometimes killed. But when it came to childbirth, the single most common medical crisis in the medieval world, it was largely powerless. And yet, every woman who married understood that childbirth was not a possibility in her future. It was a certainty, an inevitability she would face again and again, often starting before she was fully grown, in a room with no real doctor, no real medicine, and no real guarantee that she would survive it. This is the truth about medieval childbirth, not the sanitized version, the real one. The odds. Before we enter the birthing chamber, we need to understand the numbers. Modern childbirth in developed countries carries a maternal mortality rate of roughly 0.01%. In medieval Europe, estimates vary, but historians and medical scholars generally place maternal mortality somewhere between 1 and 3% per birth. That number sounds small until you consider that a medieval woman might give birth 6, 8, 10, or more times across her lifetime. Each pregnancy was a fresh roll of the dice. Each delivery was a new chance for something to go catastrophically wrong. Among the nobility, where records are better preserved, the death toll is stark. Historical records show queen after queen, noblewoman after noblewoman, dying in childbed or in the weeks that followed. Jane Seymour, third wife of Henry VIII, died 12 days after delivering the son Henry had wanted for decades. She was not unusual. She was typical. Across all social classes, women understood that pregnancy was not simply the beginning of new life. It was also potentially the end of their own. The birthing chamber. When a medieval woman's labor began, she entered a world that was almost entirely female. Men were excluded from the birthing chamber, not as a kindness, but as a matter of deep cultural convention, rooted in both modesty and superstition. The birthing room became a sanctuary of women, sealed against the outside world. The chamber itself was prepared with deliberate care. Windows were covered or closed. The room was kept dark and warm. Fresh rushes might be laid on the floor. The bed was prepared with whatever clean linens the household could provide. Among wealthier families, special birthing furniture might be present. A birthing chair or stool that allowed the laboring woman to deliver in a more upright position, which was actually better for the natural progression of labor than lying flat. The woman presiding over this space was the midwife. She was the most important person in the room. She was not a doctor. She had no formal medical degree. But she carried something that trained male physicians almost entirely lacked: direct, practical, hands-on experience with birth. Medieval midwives learned their craft through apprenticeship, attending dozens or hundreds of deliveries before practicing independently. They knew what normal labor looked like, and they knew when something was wrong. Within the limitations of their era, they were often genuinely skilled. Surrounding the midwife were other women, neighbors, female relatives, older women of the community who had given birth themselves and understood what the laboring woman was enduring. These women were called gossips, from the Old English word god-sib, meaning godparent or close companion. They were not there merely for emotional support, though they provided that. They were witnesses, helpers, and the social fabric that held the birthing chamber together. What could go wrong? In a modern delivery room, the list of complications that can kill a mother or child is long, but medicine has an answer for almost every item on it. In a medieval birthing chamber, that same list existed, and medicine had answers for almost none of them. Hemorrhage, severe bleeding before, during, or after delivery, was the single greatest killer of medieval mothers. There was no blood transfusion. There was no surgical intervention that could reliably stop internal bleeding. Herbal remedies were applied, prayers were said, and if the bleeding did not stop on its own, the woman died. It was that simple and that brutal. Obstructed labor, when a baby could not pass through the birth canal, was a death sentence in most cases. A trained medieval midwife had manual techniques for repositioning a poorly positioned baby, and some were genuinely effective for certain presentations. But when those techniques failed, options were catastrophically limited. In the worst cases, the choice became whether to attempt to save the mother at the cost of the child or to lose both. Surgeons could perform procedures to deliver a dead or dying infant, but these procedures themselves carried enormous risk of infection and death. Infection, childbed fever, caused by bacteria introduced during delivery, killed thousands upon thousands of medieval women in the days and weeks following an otherwise successful birth. The mother would deliver safely, survive the immediate ordeal, and then develop a fever that climbed steadily until it killed her. Medieval medicine had no understanding of bacterial infection. There was no concept of sterility. Midwives and attendants did not wash their hands between patients in any systematic way, not because they were careless, but because germ theory would not exist for another several centuries. The connection between dirty hands and dying mothers was simply not known. The role of the Church. The Church was present at medieval childbirth in ways both comforting and chilling. On one hand, religious ritual offered genuine psychological support to laboring women. Saints were invoked, particularly Saint Margaret of Antioch, the patron saint of pregnant women and childbirth. Her legend held that she had been swallowed by a dragon and emerged unharmed, making her a powerful symbol of survival against impossible odds. Relics associated with Margaret or other saints were placed near laboring women. Girdles and belts believed to hold sacred power were tied around the mother's body, and prayers were recited continuously throughout labor. On the other hand, the Church's theological framework around childbirth carried a darker edge. The pain of labor was understood in Orthodox medieval theology as the fulfillment of Eve's curse, the punishment God had decreed for the original sin in the Garden of Eden. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children. This framing meant that a woman's suffering in childbirth was not an injustice to be minimized. It was a divine punishment to be endured. Any attempt to ease that suffering too aggressively could be viewed with suspicion, as a kind of defiance of God's ordained order. This theological position had real consequences. It shaped how medieval medicine thought about pain relief in childbirth, and it shaped how laboring women themselves understood their own suffering. Not as something that should be prevented, but as something that had meaning, that was expected, and that they were spiritually obligated to bear. If the baby survived, if the birth went well, if the mother survived and the child was delivered alive, the immediate priorities were clear. The baby needed to be baptized as quickly as possible. Medieval infant mortality was staggeringly high. A significant proportion of children born in medieval Europe did not survive their first year. Given this reality, baptism was treated with tremendous urgency. An unbaptized child who died was, in the medieval theological framework, excluded from heaven. Parents understood this. Midwives were authorized by the Church to perform emergency baptisms if a priest could not arrive in time, using whatever water was at hand. The new mother, meanwhile, entered a period called the lying in. For a period of several weeks, when no longer among wealthier women who could afford it, she was expected to rest, remain indoors, and be cared for by other women. This was genuinely protective. It reduced her exposure to infection and allowed her body to begin recovery. At the end of the lying-in period came the ceremony of churching, a formal ritual in which the mother was blessed by a priest and officially reintegrated into the community and the church. Some historians read churching as a purification ritual, implying that childbirth had rendered a woman spiritually unclean. Others read it more charitably, as a thanksgiving ceremony celebrating her survival. In all likelihood, it carried elements of both. What it meant to be a medieval mother? To be a medieval mother was to live in a permanent state of managed risk. It was to carry children through 9 months of pregnancy with no prenatal care in any modern sense, no reliable way to monitor the health of the baby or yourself, and no certainty that either of you would survive what came next. It was to enter the birthing chamber knowing that women you had known, neighbors, sisters, your own mother perhaps, had not come out of rooms like this one. And it was, for many medieval women, also an experience of profound community, of female solidarity, of a bond forged in extremity between the women who labored and the women who stayed beside them through it. The gossips in the birthing chamber were not simply witnesses. They were the human network that made survival more likely and suffering more bearable. Medieval childbirth was not romantic. It was not safe. It was not gentle. It was one of the most dangerous things a human body could undergo, and medieval women underwent it repeatedly, without anesthesia, without surgery, without any of the tools we now consider basic. They survived it when they did, through skill, through luck, through prayer, and through each other. That is the truth about medieval childbirth. Raw, dangerous, and deeply human.